Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to what is now our fifth video in the Universal Materials series. So today we're going to go over the structure, not of the hero's journey like we did last time, but the structure of tragedy, of tragic narratives. There are generally two basic forms of story structures in most of Western literature. One is that of a comedy, which is not, what we think of when we think of like, a movie genre of like, haha, like, slapstick stuff all the time. That's not the original term, what the original term of comedy means. The original term is referring to any story that ends with some sort of a positive resolution. Typically, in most ancient traditions, it ends with a marriage of some kind. So with a comedy, you have a character beginning in a negative place or a relatively negative place, and then ending their story or their narrative in a positive place, or a more positive place than they were in the beginning. Now, in the tragedy, it's the flip side of that. So it's a story with a not so positive ending and some kind of very negative outcome for the character, the main character. So we have the character beginning in a relatively good place, but ending in a worse place overall. Okay. Now, a couple things that I want to discuss and explore with this particular structure, similar to the hero's journey, when we were looking at why was it that that structure is so popular and so resounding with us as human beings, I want to do the same thing with tragedy, because it's become sort of a cliche to criticize typical American English classes curriculum as being really, really focused on tragedy. I mean, it's a nonstop joke, even when I was in high school and before, that we just read a ton of just downer stories, and these stories that just have really, really, almost comically awful events in them. And I want to explore why that is and why it is that these have such a profound impact on us, and why it is that our imaginations are really drawn to them. And that even if they're not necessarily our go-to sort of stories that we would love to watch, there's something that we find very fulfilling and very kind of attractive and entrancing about them. So what is a tragedy, essentially? As I kind of wrote out here, a story dealing with tragic events and having an unhappy ending, especially one concerning the downfall of the main character. Okay, that's the notion that we really need to think of, is that we have a character who's going to go through some sort of downfall in their journey that they set out on. Now, a couple points of vocabulary that we need to kind of familiarize ourselves with are these four terms right here that we're going to find in our discussion of tragedy, that if you are reading a tragedy or studying a tragedy, you're going to come across these in some way, shape, or form. The first is kind of a technical one. It's the role of a chorus in a tragedy. So tragedy as a genre really developed or kind of bloomed into existence in ancient Greece. I'm thinking particularly of the Greek playwright Sophocles. So Sophocles wrote, we don't even know how many plays he originally wrote, and he was part of the Dionysian sort of festivals where the Greek authors would get together and they would have their plays performed almost like it was the Academy Awards, and we would have the populace trying to absorb them and really engross themselves in these stories, and then vote on which was the best, and then reward the author of that particular tragedy. Well, on the stage of those tragedies was always a character or a group of characters known as the chorus. And it says, as it's written out here, a group of performers who comment on the main action, typically speaking and moving together. So typically you're going to see not just one character act as the chorus. You're going to see possibly a group of characters, almost like a choral performance. That's what this word is referring back to when we said we're going to listen to the chorus sing. So in some productions of more like contemporary productions of these Greek plays, you'll have an actual chorus of characters just sitting there and kind of interacting with their scenes, but every other break in the action or so, they'll just sing. And the singing that they are doing and the chanting that they're doing is a reflection on what just happened in the story. Okay. So that's the chorus. Now, hamartia is probably the most central term for understanding what tragedy is all about. It is typically defined as, the tragic flaw within a hero. Now, to be a little bit more advanced here, guys, the term hamartia technically and literally means to miss the mark. It is an archery term that we end up reworking into our term for sin in religious contexts. It means that we have an aim that we are trying to get to, and we have missed that aim in some way, shape, or form, and to some degree. When we're talking about tragedy, it means that there's something within a character that is essential to their behavior, to their personality, and to their whole soul, their whole state of being, that is just off, that there's something really wrong, and they're typically not even aware of it. But we as the audience are. And it is this hamartia, it is this flaw that they have, which is going to lead to their tragic downfall, and is going to really kind of cause the events of this person's life to spiral out. Now, the most common and the most resounding, and in my opinion, the most damaging and the most dangerous hamartia that a person could have in stories and in real life is what the Greeks would call hubris, which is an excess of pride or self-confidence. And to understand that concept is something I think worth really considering for all students is what does pride really mean? Now, we of course are struggling with the limits of the English language there. We are conflating the term, well, we can conflate pride and pride, right? We can conflate taking, pride in your work, taking pride in your children and your family, being, proud of something that you have achieved. That's okay. That's kind of like self-esteem. Like, I'm happy that I've done this. I'm happy that this is succeeding for me. But when we use pride in its more archaic sense, like hubris, what we're saying is that you think of yourself in a way that is inconsistent with reality. And it typically means you think of yourself way too much, and you think of yourself as being worth way more than you are actually worth, or maybe even or as being more important than you actually are, as being more intelligent than you actually are. As being more, you pick the characteristic. It's these people and it is who examine this trait that they're just the greatest thing in the world, that they are, essentially like the god of their own story. It's really kind of an ugly feature. The more you study the ancient, the myths, and the more you study the ancient literature, and even more kind of classic literature, the more you see that both ancient religions and ancient myths and ancient cultures were really keenly aware that this is the cardinal sin, that this is the cardinal and worst feature that someone could have in their personality. It is to be arrogant. It is to be hyperly arrogant about yourself. Now, I won't do it here, but there are so many different ways, whether it's in a tragic story or it's in a religious setting or it's in a psychological setting, when you're trying to look at someone and you're looking at their behavior and you're like, they're arrogant. They're certainly arrogant, but it's showing itself in a very unique and very different way. So you always want to be kind of aware of this sort of a feature, because most of our villains, most of our tragic heroes and tragic figures are going to exhibit this type of hubris, this type of pride and arrogance. Okay. Now, catharsis is a typical term that we hear a lot in English analysis. And it is also something that derives its history, or is derived from the history of the tragic narratives, of tragic structure. And the catharsis is, and when referencing Greek tragedy, or when referencing tragedy in general, it refers to a process or the stage in the story where the audience and the characters have some sort of release or some sort of closure with the emotions that have been kind of building up on stage, building up in the narrative. So it's, a breakdown finally, it's an outcry of all the things that have happened. It's just kind of like this emotional, torrent after all these terrible things have happened, okay? I think one of the contemporary examples that jumps into my head is in the Shakespeare film, the Steven Spielberg film, Schindler's List. Schindler's List is a 3 or so hour long, just heartbreaking film and very, very graphic film depicting the events of the Holocaust surrounding Oskar Schindler. And it's a very, very tough movie to watch for a number of different reasons, but there's a scene at the end where Oskar Schindler breaks down. It's a now famous scene, and that essentially is a catharsis. That's him finally breaking down. And if there's a moment when people cry in that movie, it's usually with that, because I think Spielberg was very, very being very tactful with how he was creating that movie. He was, building the tension, and he was really kind of holding us in check for a while, and then giving his character permission to finally have this emotional outpouring, and then his audience, will follow suit. So it works very, very effectively. That same pattern is seen in basically every tragic structure we're going to see. So the first stage that we're going to go through the 5 stages of tragedy. And I believe, and I have to correct myself, and someone can fact check me on this, I believe this comes from Aristotle's Poetics, the 5 stages of tragedy. The first one is the exposition, okay, which, as good students of English literature will know, that this is when we are given the basic background information, we are setting the scene, okay? So in a Shakespeare play, which are usually 5 acts, you're going to see Act 1 being an exposition act, when we're going to get the information surrounding the situation, the characters, and the background stuff that we just needed to know, okay? Now, throughout this particular presentation, I've given a bunch of different little examples here. So we could have, the examples from ancient literature. We have down here Oedipus the king, who's confronting the Sphinx. So he's not the king at that point, but he comes to Thebes, the city that he was traveling from when he left his supposed hometown. And when he gets to Thebes, he encounters, the problem in the city of the Sphinx that's terrorizing everybody and forcing people to try to solve her riddle. And if you can't solve a riddle, she destroys you. She devours you. Now, Oedipus, comes to the city and is able to solve the riddle. That makes him king, and that's really the beginning of his story. That's how it sort of starts out. Now, Romeo and Juliet is very, very similar to this. It follows the same sort of structure. The whole first act of Romeo and Juliet is essentially just telling us, hey, who are the Capulets? Who are the Montagues? What's going on in Verona? What is this boy Romeo like? What is this girl Juliet like? And how are they eventually going to meet? That's all the first act is about, of course. Okay. The second stage is the growing conflict. Okay. So here is where our authors introduce the conflict of the play, introduce what was established or what was set up in the first act, and really kind of begins to flesh it out and let it bloom forward. So Act 1, we set the stage. We get the context. We know where we are. We know what the characters are. And we get a little clue as to what the main conflict is going to be. And then Act 2 is when it really starts to spring forward. Okay. So in some situations, that is when like for Oedipus the king, that's when Tiresias the prophet kind of comes in and tells us, here's the problem, dude. Like there are a lot of serious problems in Thebes, some that I really don't want to talk about, that are leading to the plagues and all the other terrible things that are happening, which kind of spring that play, Oedipus the king, forward. Now, in Romeo and Juliet over here, it's the kind of mounting conflict between Tybalt, right? Tybalt is a background character in the play for most of for the 2 scenes that he's in, or for the 2 acts that he's in. And then, we kind of see his conflict with Romeo and with the Montague family building up more and more and more, as well as the conflict between Romeo and Juliet and their families building up more and more. So good kind of mounting tension here. And of course, what we're mounting to is Act 3 or Stage 3, which is the crisis, which is when that conflict reaches a boiling point and it finally kind of explodes out into the open. Now, this is the middle of the story, and that kind of follows a really kind of not cliche, but a very classic structure of storytelling, which is at the middle of the story is when someone usually dies or something really, really bad is going to happen, because it's like the final kind of crisis that needs to occur to get the whole story really rolling. Now, I think particularly as the image over here depicts of the Iliad, I think of when Hector kills Patroclus, and Achilles then kills Hector and does the atrocious thing that he does to his body. That is the initial crisis. That is a result of the conflicts that were set up beforehand, and the characters that have been set up beforehand really finally overwhelming the narrative and exploding. Same thing with Romeo and Juliet. The crisis is, of course, when Romeo not just marries Juliet, but when he gets into this brawl and impulsively, goes after Tybalt. And the 2 of them, cause a huge brawl. And then we have Tybalt killed and Mercutio slain as well. These actions that happen here do 2 major things. Number one is that they really kind of, like I said, propel the rest of the narrative forward so that we have to be carried along with it and see how this is going to be resolved, because something happens here that cannot just be ignored. It needs to be resolved. It needs to be dealt with. It's going to have serious consequences for the rest of the story. The other major thing that happens here, which I always point out to my students when we're in the middle of Act 3 of a Romeo and Juliet play, or of a Shakespeare play, or if we're in the middle of a text, is when the hamartia really becomes clear, when the tragic flaw of the characters becomes very, very clear. We could have some clues about it, and in the first and the second stages of the tragedy, we might have had a really good idea of what it is by the second one. But the third stage and the third act of a play, like we have it completely clear. There is no guessing anymore, right? We know what it is. So for Achilles, it's his rage. It's this kind of like arrogant, prideful rage that this kid has. For Oedipus, it's very clearly his own blindness and his own kind of self-aggrandizement and thinking that he's perfectly safe and fine. And then for Romeo and Juliet, it's of course Romeo's impulsiveness. It's his kind of just acting on his immediate emotions. As a result of this, we have the catastrophe, which in the fourth stage is when something terrible finally happens, right? We have the real horrible things kind of resulting from that crisis. So the example over here, again, famously depicted in the Iliad, in Homer's Iliad, is after the crisis of Patroclus's murder, or not murder, but his killing, then we have Achilles actually coming forward and killing Hector. That's the catastrophe, right? That there's a fallout from that event. Achilles goes and he kills Hector and then does what he does to his body. So there's actually kind of a mix up there. It's just the death of Patroclus is the crisis. Now here is the catastrophe. With Oedipus the king down here, famously, is that when he does find out really what is wrong with his life, which is the fact that he has murdered his father unknowingly, and that he has unknowingly for at least 12 or so years been sleeping with his mother and having at least 4 children with her. As a result, he tears out his eyes or stabs out his eyes rather, and just cannot bear to think about or bear to look at what he's done. Now, in Romeo and Juliet, of course, that the catastrophe is the killing, right? Is the suicide of both Romeo and Juliet, and then all the other people that die kind of in between. And we'll talk about the contemporary examples, but yeah, that's a catastrophe. The Greek word catastrophe kind of gives us some clue as to how to understand this. Catastrophe just means change. It means a sudden change. Okay. It doesn't necessarily mean a bad change. That's why we've kind of infused that meaning with it, that it's a sudden, really negative change. But in terms of literal understanding of language here, it just means a sudden change. So think of it in the structure as something finally happening that we could never go back from, where things are just, there is no turning back now, okay? Now, we have as the final stage, the catharsis. Okay, or sometimes people call it the recognition, right? Where the characters on stage in the story are having to now deal with the crisis that has happened, the catastrophe that fell out from that, and now we're trying to understand or kind of deal with what's happened now. Okay. And typically, I like the way that this passage articulates it, or this sentence articulates it. It says, the audience is left with a lesson as the characters review the tragic hero's fall from grace. That's a typical, and this is going to, again, provide us some insight as to why tragedy is so popular and so moving to us as a species, or as a culture, is because it very clearly kind of shows us something that we should not do. It very, very clearly shows us that. And there usually seems to be some kind of statement or some kind of action that really underlines that at the end of a good tragedy. So I'm thinking again, of course, over here of the Iliad, right? The real climax and the real catharsis of the Iliad is when Achilles is confronted by the father of Hector after Achilles has desecrated Hector's body out of his mourning of his friend. This confrontation And during this confrontation, Achilles finally yields and he finally lets go of his anger and tries to repent for it. He tries to make up for what he has done to some degree. Okay. That's the catharsis. And he's finally able to kind of really mourn and bury Patroclus properly and all of this kind of stuff. In Oedipus the King, it's not only just Oedipus's action of stabbing out his eyes, it's also his, because that's not where the play ends. The play really ends after he gives this very long speech about how awful his life has become and how terrible it is, and he just bemoans that fact. And then he tells everybody that he needs to go into exile now that he cannot be king any longer. And of Romeo and Juliet, of course, it's the ending of Act 5, is after Romeo and Juliet do kill themselves, there's a long scene where the parents of Romeo and Juliet, the surviving parents of Romeo and Juliet, and the Prince of Verona, all basically, just like in Oedipus, bemoan how terrible this situation is and was and why it happened, basically. And there's some sort of resolution and some sort of an attempt to kind of put the world somewhat back together afterwards. Okay, so that's the fifth stage. Now, a couple things. When looking at tragedy, whether it's in all of the ancient Greek theater, whether it's from medieval, sort of tragedies up into the present day tragedies that we could see in contemporary culture, they all generally fall within three different categories or patterns of tragedy. And I usually teach my students to them as these three forms of tragedy. So when we think of the term tragedy, we need to think of some sort of pattern like these. The first pattern is, as it says up here, acting on incomplete information. We have a character or characters learn something, and then they act on it in some way, shape, or form. And then what becomes clear is that the information that they had is not actually the full story, or is something that they probably shouldn't have acted on because that would have allowed them to avoid their tragedy. Now, the cliche example again is, of course, Oedipus the King, as depicted over here. He received the prophecy that he would, in fact, marry his mother and kill his father. And as a result of that, of hearing just that bit of information, he immediately leaves town and he runs out into the next town down the road, okay? Because he wants to get as far away from his mom and his dad, who he thinks is his mom and his dad as he can. Of course, what happens is that on his attempt to avoid that fate, he ends up running right into the people who really were his mom and dad the whole time, okay? So that was incomplete information. I'm thinking also of, just because, my contemporary nerd brain always thinks about this stuff. I think of a character like Lord Voldemort, Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle, or Voldemort at that point, receives the prophecy about what's going to happen with him and Harry Potter, or Neville. And then he only receives a part of it because the prophecy only tells him a little bit of the information. And as a result, he then goes and acts on it. He goes and tries to kill Harry Potter and James and Lily Potter as well. Well, in doing so, what has he done? He's run right into the actions that are going to fulfill that prophecy. So that's a very typical pattern that we see. We see either from a prophecy or from a letter, like in Romeo and Juliet, or from just a Shakespearean misunderstanding. We have a character act on information that is not totally complete and then have a tragic result. The other one, and something that I usually see a little bit more, being a little bit more common, particularly in ancient stories, is having to choose between two terrible options, where we are facing, as the phrase goes, a Scylla and Charybdis situation, where there is no good option. There is no positive option. We have two negatives. We have something that's bad, and we have something that's even worse, possibly, okay? The really good example of this, aside from Scylla and Charybdis, is this the story of this kid right here, Orestes. Okay, so in short, what's Orestes' story? Orestes is the son of King Agamemnon and Queen Clytemnestra. And Agamemnon, as you might have remembered, was the king who really launched and kind of led the war against Troy. Except in doing so, in order to do so, he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. And that didn't go over well with his wife. So by the time he returns home from Troy, he gets home and he gets in the bathtub, and his wife, with the help of her lover, slit his throat in the bathtub. Okay, not so good. but you know, he sort of, we could see why it was coming down the road. Or Orestes gets home and he realizes, oh my gosh, my mother has murdered my father. Well, what do you do now? Because the kind of customs, the customs of justice at that time said you always must avenge your father. If your father is unjustly killed, you need to avenge him. Okay, fine. But there's an equally important kind of custom of morality at the time that says, hey, don't kill your mother. Matricide is a grave crime. So what do you do here? Do you allow your father to be, you know, killed unjustly? Do you allow, you know, your mother to now have to be killed by you? So what does he do? So he goes through a lot of conflicts, and then that situation right there is a tragic situation. There just is no good option. Similarly, as we're going to cover in 10th grade, the story of Antigone, who is the eldest, I think the eldest daughter of Oedipus the king, is another perfect example of this structure of tragedy when we have no clear good option. Antigone wants to bury her brother, Eteocles, I think. I can't remember if it was Eteocles or Polynices. So she has to go and, or she wants to go and bury him because her uncle, Creon, has dictated that because this son of Oedipus was a traitor and tried to overthrow the state, he needs to, his body, after having been killed, needs to lie out on the open road and just be, you know, desecrated. Well, of course, the customs of the ancient world, and particularly ancient Greece, really abhorred that. They said, no, you need to bury a soul, or bury a body, and then let their soul rest. Therefore, this is a serious affront to the gods and affront to justice. Well, Creon has dictated that anyone who does so, anyone who gives any sort of burial to this body, will be executed. So Antigone has two terrible choices there. She can either allow her brother to be desecrated and allow his soul never to rest in the afterlife ever again. Or she can bury him, give him the funeral rites, knowing that that will lead to her death, her execution by the state for disobeying the king. There is no good option there. Anything she does is going to be a bad option. It's going to lead to a tragic situation. Okay, perfect examples. And then finally, the most common and the most basic pattern of tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, is when a character succumbs to their hamartia, when they are presented as having this very, very serious, tragic flaw within them. And through whatever challenges they face, through whatever conflicts arise in the story, they just can't overcome it. And maybe it even leads to the conflicts that face them in life. And as a result, they have some sort of downfall. They have some sort of tragic situation ensue as a result. The examples I give are the most obvious ones. Achilles, right? Achilles' rage, his kind of arrogant rage, finally leads to his dishonoring of himself as he, you know, completely, in a sacrilege sort of way, dishonors Hector's body. Okay, the behavior of Narcissus, right? The self-love of Narcissus, his obsession with himself, to the belittlement of all others around him, and to the, you know, devaluing of all others around him, leads to his death, right? And of course, the character of Creon, the uncle of Antigone, the brother-in-law of Oedipus, who becomes king after Oedipus leaves the city, his arrogance and his just incredible stubbornness and his lack of wisdom on top of it lead to his really, really terrible downfall, with the, you know, the death of his son, the suicide of his son and his niece and his wife. You know, he's left with nothing as a result of his stubbornness. Really, really tragic situation. These are the examples, or these are the best examples that kind of come to mind of when a character just can't, you know, escape their tragic flaw, their hamartia. Okay, so when referencing the structure of tragedy, I like to, and as you kind of could tell through some of my slides already, I like to refer back to contemporary culture, to religion, to psychology, and talk about why it is that this particular genre has such a lasting impact. So we see it everywhere in artwork. Okay, we see tragic figures everywhere in artwork. We see it obviously through the visual arts, through Greek theater and Shakespeare and the Renaissance as well. Um, why? Why? Well, we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail here, but I want to look at the influences that it has had. So most of the artwork that we are going to see, that we're going to read, if you go and study the classics, include something tragic. So I gave the clear example up there of the descent of Christ after the crucifixion, right? So the whole crucifixion scene, the whole crucifixion imagery, it is in and of itself a tragedy. It is one of the most tragic scenes that we have in our culture today. We see the most famous stories of Western literature are tragedies. The Iliad, the most famous Greek epic poem, maybe next to the Odyssey, is itself a tragedy. It's not a positive, glory be to war kind of story. It's meant to be a tragedy about this kid, Achilles. The stories of Shakespeare, the poems, the plays of Shakespeare, the most famous ones are always his tragedies. When we look into psychology, particularly the birth of psychology with Sigmund Freud, he really fixates on our human almost obsession with the genre of tragedy as a demonstration for him of our anxieties, of our deep-seated fears. So when you look at Freudian theory, as we mentioned back in our lenses of interpretation video, Freudian theory really rests on this kind of, not assumption, but this insight that human beings are obsessed in some sense with tragedy because they sort of live out tragedy, because they see and they live out and they are terrified of tragedy in their own life. All of the different ways that it can happen that we just previously listed. Yeah. Now, of course, in popular culture, I'm thinking of, in the past like 20 or 30 years, maybe 40 years, what are some of the most famous stories that we really like to fixate on that our culture has really elevated? Well, if you look at one of the most famous films ever made, like Citizen Kane, that is a tragedy. That's a very classic tragic story. The downfall of this person. When we look at a film series like The Godfather, it in and of itself is a tragedy. Mario Puzo's story is the tragedy of Michael Corleone, as are the movies as well. Even in a little bit more kind of popular culture, something like Star Wars. Star Wars, the first three films are a hero's journey. However, the prequel films are entirely a tragedy. It's the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker. Okay, I wrote Breaking Bad down there because it's one of in terms of not just films but like TV shows. It's one of the most successful television series of all time, and it's a tragedy. It's just a slow burn tragedy of how this man Walter White just degrades his moral character and has to suffer the consequences. More recently, in the past like 4 or so years, the television series on HBO Succession is exactly the same thing. It's a long, elongated story, a very complex and rich drama about the character of Kendall Roy, essentially, and how he just cannot, inherit his father's kingdom, and why he can't do that, and why he shouldn't do that. It's a wonderful example of how tragedy can work itself out. So, the final questions and thoughts for us to really consider, ladies and gentlemen, are right here. Number one, why actually is this genre so popular throughout the ages? I think the fundamental reason why, or at least the first point that we need to at least address in exploring why it's so popular, is that we as human beings, when we reflect upon the world, when we look at the world, we recognize inherently that life has tragic elements. So what I typically do in class when we end a tragic story is on one of our warm-up questions, I will ask my students, is life fundamentally a tragedy or a comedy, right? Like a comedy or a journey, a positive story. What is this thing that we're doing here? What is this story that we are living out? Because we are, as we mentioned last time, we are all living out a story in some way, shape, or form. Well, are we living out a tragedy or are we living out a comedy? Well, one thing that you have to say, no matter what point you pick, is that life has tragic elements. For example, the one of the best examples is that we are all going to die, is that we are confronted with the reality of death, that we are not going to exist in this world indefinitely, apparently. Okay. So there's that. There's this death thing. Well, how does that death brought about? Sometimes it's through completely random accidents that there seems to be no clear blame for. Sometimes it's the result of sickness and disease. That's pretty terrible. I particularly like to mention, for example, I bring this up and when we read the novel or the novella of Mice and Men. One of the things I like to focus on in Of Mice and Men is that John Steinbeck is illustrating in that story through every single one of his characters that there is something tragic that is looming over that character. Whether it's Crooks with his back being broken by the oppressive kind of racism and embittering nature of racism at the time, whether it's Lenny who is crippled by his own mental inhibitions, whether it's George who is crippled by his own limitations and his responsibilities to Lenny to some degree. Every single character has to deal with something that is fundamentally a result of inherent human limitations, inherent human laziness, inherent human weakness in attempting to deal with their problems, and inherent human malevolence, okay, human evil. So that is maybe the second feature that I always like to bring up is not only are we in a world where we could die and we could be injured and we are going to die no matter what, where death is inevitable. So we're heading towards this kind of, finale of death. But on top of it, we all have inherent, really serious limitations as human beings. The first of which is ignorance. Like we talked about before, we are all profoundly ignorant. We don't understand everything that's happening around us. So we're like kind of, little blind mice, trying to figure out what life is all about, what we're supposed to do. On top of that, not only are we just blind, but we are also what do we call it? Very, very weak. We have like in terms of willpower, we have this weakness to us where we can't just overcome our desire to be more motivated, our desire to be more courageous. We have to. It's hard. It's hard to work at it. We have these flaws within us. On top of that, we are, and probably the worst of all, is that we have this propensity towards malevolence. So not only is the world, set up to be very dangerous and eventually going to lead to death, and not only are we limited, but on top of that, we are actually, there are people in this world, maybe, we are among them, that actively will make the world worse and inflict more tragedy on people. So all of that, and then our struggles in trying to deal with that, I think really explains why humans, when they look at the world and they recognize all of that, maybe they don't articulate it like I just did, maybe they just inherently kind of intuitively feel it, they're really drawn to these stories of tragedy. I think that's why, whether you tell a story that's a journey or in a comedy fundamentally, or you tell a story that's a tragedy fundamentally, those elements of tragedy are going to be in any good story, any really kind of profound, moving, and enduring story that we tell. So if you go through literature in the past 5,000 years, and you pick out maybe the top 10 that have really shaped and really shaped the world and really kind of drawn most people's attention, they are going to, if not be a complete tragedy, they are going to have very serious tragic elements in them. And the example, of course, I love the religious example, is of course the story of Christ, the Christian story of the world. It includes maybe one of at least narratively, one of the worst tragedies you could think of, which is the execution of a completely innocent man, not only an innocent man, but a maximally good man. So yeah, so I think all of those reasons are why we are so fixated on these stories. Now, there's one other reason, I think, why we also might be so fixated on it, and I think it's because we are afraid of tragedy. We are, in some sense, trying to educate ourselves and maybe prepare ourselves for the tragedies of the world and the inherent tragedies of life through this particular medium. The phrase or the quote that always sticks in my head and I like to share with my students all the time was from the Marvel film, The Black Panther, when T'Challa's father overtly tells him in the afterlife that any father who has not prepared his son for his own death has failed as a father. Well, what King T'Chaka is basically teaching there is that you, as any really good teacher who's trying to educate someone beneath them about the world, needs to prepare them for the inevitable tragedy. Okay, so it needs to teach them that they are going to suffer, they are going to lose certain things in life. It's going to happen. That's just part of how it is. So I think that's maybe why this has been so popular, is that we're trying as a culture, as human beings, to prepare ourselves and to educate ourselves about what the world is, and of course, on top of that, educate ourselves about how to navigate through it properly and how to avoid unnecessary tragedy. Okay. Now, the next question here, a little bit complicated because it depends on the tragedy, but who is at fault in each tragedy? Well, the tricky one. I would say probably for about, yeah, like maybe over 95% of tragedies that we would read, it's the fault of the main character, that they are in some way, shape, or form at fault for what has happened. You know, even in a situation like Othello, where Othello is very clearly being manipulated and deceived, he acts in a negative way. He acts out of rage. This is still at some point his fault. So that's, I think, the best you could do. Like I love talking to my students and we debate, you know, who is at fault in Romeo and Juliet's story for their suicide? Is it their family for pushing them to that degree? Is that what we're going to say, that it's entirely the fault of society and the fault of families? Or is it entirely their fault? Could they have completely acted in a more rational and a more controlled and a more virtuous way than by taking their own lives? Welcome to the debate, you know? But I think one thing is very clear, which is that the authors of tragedies, even while they might make those questions a little bit complicated here and there, they might pile on the faults on other people as well. There is some degree to which the fundamental fault lies on the main character. And that, guys and gals, if you haven't noticed, links back to what we were saying about the archetype of the shadow in the hero's journey cycle, which is the idea that deep down, fundamentally, at bedrock base, at the end of the day, your true enemy, the true enemy of our lives, the true source of tragedy, of a fundamental, the worst tragedy in our lives, is going to be ourselves, okay? Is going to be some negative feature within our own souls, okay? So, you know, just like the now famous phrase in Phantom of the Opera, when Christine sings to the Phantom at the end, this haunted face, you know, you hold no horror for me now. It's in your soul that the true distortion lies. The tragedies of the world are nothing when compared to the tragedies and distortions within your own soul, within your own character. So it's kind of like what I was saying before in that same lesson, that it's okay to some degree if we are afflicted with the inherent tragedies of life, right? If we are simply victims of death, victims of mortality, victims of the chaos of the world, maybe even victims of the malevolence of other people, that's okay. But the true tragedy happens when we are the ones inflicting tragedy on others, when we have morally degraded ourselves, when we are not able to transform into better people, into who we really should be as virtuous human beings. That failure is the true tragedy, I think. So the tragedy, for example, of like Anakin Skywalker, is not just that he loses his wife and a lot of Jedi die. That's not just the tragedy. The real tragedy is that he becomes Darth Vader. He becomes one of the most evil people in the world, in the galaxy. Okay, so that's that one. Now, how can they educate us? How can tragedy educate us? Well, we've kind of already covered that. Tragedy fundamentally is educating us about what the world can be like, what exists in the world, right? It's showing you what you will confront in life And it is trying to demonstrate to you, through a negative example usually, how not to behave, how not to be. It's giving you kind of an image of, a defense against the dark arts kind of image of like, don't behave like this. Do not do this, right? A negative kind of moral teaching, negative theology, if you want. And it's also, I think, very clearly trying to teach us and warn us about the consequences of what will happen if we don't listen. I've always remembered one of the most arresting examples of that exists in the play Antigone with that character of Creon. So Creon is a father figure who will not listen to anyone else around him, and he will not acknowledge where he is wrong, and he will not yield where he very clearly, I think, sees that he's wrong. And just because of that stubbornness, because of that just incredibly narcissistic sort of behavior, what happens around him? Not only do other people suffer around him, but he, as a result, loses everyone. His niece dies. His son kills himself as a result of what his father has done, of what Creon has done. And his wife then, as a result, kills herself. And he is left with nothing as a result. Everything that was truly meaningful and truly good in his life is destroyed. And he's left this, just crippled, horrible mess of a human being. And I've always loved that example for students, and students have kind of gravitated towards it because when I discuss with them, like, what does it look like to fail as a parent? What does it look like to fail as a family member? What does that really look like? And they come up with no better answer than what a failure of a father looks like is someone who essentially helps drive their children to something like suicide, to something like self-destruction. That is one very, very serious way that a father could fail. Now, we see all of those sorts of consequences, and I think that's the reason why they're so graphic at times, like with Oedipus, or Darth Vader. I think that's why these finales are so graphic, is because they're warning you. They're meant to say, look, this is what could happen if you are afraid of things now. Just wait. Things are going to get much worse if you don't change. Okay. And that is, if we want to link this finally before we leave today, we want to link this back with something like the hero's journey. We go back to the question about, why do we refuse the call to the hero's journey? Why do we refuse the call to deal with whatever crisis is facing us? It's because we're afraid. We are afraid of that dragon. We are afraid of that conflict. Well, I like the phrase that I've heard from one of my teachers that's fine, but it's not bad that you're afraid. What's bad is that you're not afraid of the right thing. You're afraid of being, eaten by the dragon while you're going out and fighting him, right? Okay, that's pretty bad, but it's not as bad as a world where the dragon just unmitigatedly sweeps through your entire life and destroys everything that you love, right? That's even worse. So, like I've been saying, I think a couple times now, you're afraid of failing at, becoming a better person. You're afraid of the hard work that it will result in. You're afraid of all of the challenges that it will face you with, and you're afraid of putting in that work. That's fine. You should be afraid because it's a lot of work, but you should be even more afraid at truly failing to be a better person, at truly becoming someone who is very, very wicked and evil. That's what you should be afraid of. You should be afraid of something tyrannically evil like that, not just simple hard work and discomfort and suffering in the basic sense like that. So learn to be afraid of the right things, I think, is what tragedy is really sort of teaching us here. Okay, so that in short is a quick run through of the structure of tragedy. Next time that I see you, we will, I think, go over, for the 6th video and the final video in this series, we're going to go over just some basic essay writing tools. So we're away from all the basic kind of literary stuff. We're going to jump real quickly into a little bit about writing, and then we will be done with the Universal series. Thanks.